Chosen One. The story begins at the moment when something long hidden finally breaks the surface of reality. For a long time, you felt the tension of words spoken behind closed doors, conversations happening in rooms you never entered, and narratives forming that you could sense but could never fully confront. There were whispers, subtle changes in how people treated you, and an atmosphere of suspicion that seemed to follow you without explanation. At times, you questioned whether you were imagining it, because the accusations were never spoken openly enough to challenge directly. Yet deep inside, your spirit knew that something was unfolding beyond your sight. What began as a quiet smear campaign moved slowly through conversations, misunderstandings, and distorted fragments of your story. Pieces of truth were taken out of context and reshaped into something that looked convincing enough to circulate. People who barely knew you formed opinions based on second-hand information, while those who should have asked questions often chose the easier path of believing the narrative already spreading. For a while, it seemed as if the atmosphere in every room had been tilted against you before you even walked through the door. Chosen One. The remarkable part of this moment is that you did not fight the battle the way most people expected. Instead of responding with noise, retaliation, or endless attempts to defend yourself, you chose a different path. You chose dignity when chaos invited you to argue. You chose restraint when anger tried to pull you into reaction. You chose integrity over the temptation to manage your image through manipulation. That decision felt lonely at times, because silence often appears weak to those who misunderstand it. Yet heaven was watching every step of that choice. Now something has shifted. The lies that once lived comfortably in separate conversations have begun colliding with each other in the open. Contradictions have surfaced. Stories that once sounded convincing now fall apart under simple questions. The same people who tried to shape every room against you are now confronted by the inconsistencies within their own narratives. Truth has a remarkable way of surviving longer than fabrication, and the moment has arrived when those fabricated versions can no longer sustain themselves. Chosen One, this moment is not merely about being proven right. Heaven is not interested in petty victory or public humiliation of your opponents. What is happening now is something far more meaningful. God is defending the person who refused to abandon integrity when pressure made compromise seem easier. He is honoring the quiet strength that allowed you to endure misunderstanding without surrendering your character. The realization that opens this story is therefore powerful. The people who once believed they could control every room through whispers and manipulation are now caught in the very contradictions they created. Their carefully constructed narrative has collapsed under the weight of truth, and heaven is using that collapse to clear the path in front of you. What once blocked your progress is now dissolving, not because you forced it to break, but because truth has finally stepped into the light. Chosen One, the conflict that eventually unfolded around your name did not begin with loud accusations or open confrontation. It began quietly, at the moment when you made a decision that seemed simple on the surface, but carried enormous consequences beneath it. For a long time, you had been the stabilizing force in someone else's life. Your presence brought calm where there had been confusion. Your patience softened moments of emotional chaos. Your ability to listen, understand, and remain steady created an atmosphere where another person could feel grounded, even when their own life lacked clarity. In many ways, you became the emotional climate in which that person functioned. When their thoughts were scattered, your perspective helped bring order. When their emotions surged with anxiety or insecurity, your calm steadiness restored balance. Conversations with you often ended with them feeling lighter, clearer, and reassured. At the beginning, this connection may have felt natural, even meaningful. It seemed as if your presence had a positive influence on their life, and you may have believed that the mutual connection between you was built on genuine appreciation. Chosen One, the problem did not appear immediately. At first, the support you offered was received with gratitude. The person recognized that your presence brought peace into situations that might otherwise have become unstable. They valued the emotional clarity you provided and the stability you carried into their life. Yet over time, something subtle began changing. What was once appreciated slowly became expected. The calm you brought into conversations stopped feeling like a gift and began feeling like something they assumed would always be there. This shift often happens quietly. When a person becomes accustomed to receiving strength from someone else, they sometimes stop noticing the effort or emotional discipline behind that strength. The peace you carried required inner work, reflection, and spiritual grounding. It came from lessons learned through your own struggles and growth. Yet the person depending on that peace gradually stopped seeing it as something valuable. Instead, they began treating it as an automatic part of their environment, something that existed for their benefit rather than something that deserved recognition or respect. Chosen one, as this dynamic continued, another layer of imbalance formed beneath the surface. The person did not simply rely on your peace. They began leaning on it more heavily than before. Their own responsibility for emotional stability decreased because they knew you would restore balance when things became difficult. Situations that required their own reflection or growth were often redirected toward you. Instead of confronting their inner struggles, they allowed your presence to absorb the tension they created. At first, you may not have recognized the depth of this imbalance. Compassion often makes it difficult to see when support has quietly turned into dependence. You cared about the person and wanted to help them navigate the challenges they faced. Offering understanding felt natural, and your willingness to remain calm during difficult conversations seemed like the right thing to do. Yet over time, you began noticing subtle changes that could no longer be ignored. Chosen one, the conversations that once felt mutually respectful started leaving you emotionally drained. Situations that should have been shared responsibilities began falling entirely on your shoulders. You noticed that your peace was being used rather than appreciated. The person's expectations slowly grew, while their gratitude quietly disappeared. The more stability you provided, the more they relied on it without developing their own. This realization did not arrive all at once. It emerged gradually through moments of reflection and discernment. You began seeing patterns that had previously seemed insignificant. The same emotional crises appeared repeatedly without genuine attempts to resolve them. The same conversations returned without meaningful change. You realized that the peace you carried had become something the other person consumed rather than something they honored. Chosen one, that awareness led you to a difficult but necessary decision. You chose to step back. This step was not driven by anger or revenge. It was guided by wisdom. You recognized that continuing the pattern would not help either of you. By remaining the source of their emotional stability, you were unintentionally allowing them to avoid the personal growth they needed. Protecting your peace became an act of self-respect rather than rejection. The way you stepped back reflected the dignity that had always defined your character. You did not announce the decision dramatically. You did not expose their weaknesses or accuse them publicly. Instead, you quietly created distance. You stopped carrying emotional burdens that were never meant to belong to you. You allowed conversations to end without trying to fix everything. You preserved your peace without attacking theirs. Chosen one, this quiet withdrawal created something the other person was not prepared to face. For a long time, they had depended on the stability you provided, without realizing how deeply it shaped their life. When that stability suddenly became less accessible, they felt the absence immediately. Situations that once felt manageable now seemed overwhelming. Emotional turbulence returned without the calming presence that had previously balanced it. Instead of recognizing this moment as an opportunity for self-reflection, the person reacted with panic. Losing access to your peace forced them to confront their own unresolved chaos, and that experience felt uncomfortable. Rather than examining why the relationship had become imbalanced, they searched for a way to protect their own image. Admitting that they had relied too heavily on you would require humility and accountability, and those qualities are often difficult for people who are unaccustomed to them. Chosen one, this is where the campaign against you quietly began. In order to preserve their sense of control, the person began reshaping the narrative of your relationship. The distance you created was reframed as betrayal rather than boundary. Your decision to protect your peace was described as selfishness rather than wisdom. Conversations that once reflected mutual connection were rewritten to make you appear responsible for the imbalance. These new interpretations did not emerge in one dramatic moment. They developed gradually through private conversations and subtle suggestions. The person began sharing their version of events with others, often presenting themselves as the one who had been abandoned or mistreated. By shaping the story carefully, they hoped to protect themselves from the uncomfortable truth that your withdrawal had exposed. Chosen one, turning you into the villain served an important psychological purpose for them. If others believed that you had changed unfairly or behaved without compassion, they would not have to examine their own role in the breakdown of the relationship. Blame would shift away from their dependence and toward your decision to establish boundaries. In this way, the narrative they created allowed them to avoid the deeper reflection that might have led to genuine growth. The irony of this situation is that the campaign itself revealed how much they had depended on your peace. If your presence had not carried real value, your withdrawal would not have caused such a strong reaction. The panic they felt was proof that something essential had been lost when you stepped back. Yet instead of acknowledging that truth, they attempted to replace it with a story that protected their pride. Chosen one, while these events unfolded, you may have sensed the tension without fully understanding its source. You noticed shifts in how certain people treated you. Conversations carried subtle undertones that felt unfamiliar. At times, you may have questioned whether your decision to step back had created unnecessary conflict. Yet deep inside, your spirit knew that protecting your peace was the right choice. What you could not see clearly at the time was that heaven was observing the entire process. The decision you made to withdraw with dignity rather than retaliation was not weakness. It was alignment. By refusing to participate in chaos, you allowed truth to remain intact. You did not need to destroy the false narrative because falsehood always carries the seeds of its own collapse. Chosen one, the campaign against you therefore began not because you caused harm, but because you stopped allowing your peace to be consumed. Your refusal to remain the emotional atmosphere in someone else's life forced them to confront a reality they were not ready to face. In their attempt to escape that discomfort, they reshaped the story and cast you as the villain. Yet the very decision that sparked the campaign also set the stage for its eventual exposure. By stepping back with integrity, you preserved the truth of who you are. And as time continues unfolding, that truth becomes stronger than any narrative built to replace it. Chosen one, as the situation continued unfolding after you stepped back to protect your peace, the response from the other person became increasingly strategic. What began as private discomfort within them slowly transformed into a carefully managed campaign of narrative control. Instead of confronting the truth of the imbalance that had existed in the relationship, they chose another path entirely. They began shaping different versions of your story for different audiences, adjusting each account in subtle ways that would allow them to maintain sympathy and influence in every room they entered. This method of deception was not random. It required attention, calculation, and a clear understanding of how different groups of people respond to different kinds of information. The person knew that one single story might not convince everyone, so they adapted their narrative depending on who they were speaking to. Each conversation became an opportunity to plant a slightly different version of you into the minds of others, creating a web of impressions that would shape how people perceived you long before they ever had the chance to hear from you directly. Chosen one. When speaking to close friends, the story often took on an emotional tone. In those conversations, they presented themselves as deeply wounded, emphasizing the disappointment and confusion they claimed to feel after your withdrawal. They described your decision to create distance as unexpected and hurtful, carefully highlighting moments that could make you appear cold or dismissive. By framing the situation through emotion, they encouraged their friends to react with sympathy and protective loyalty, creating an atmosphere where questioning their version of events felt almost insensitive. With mentors or authority figures, however, the narrative shifted into something far more controlled and intellectual. In those conversations, they avoided dramatic emotional language and instead presented a carefully reasoned explanation that appeared thoughtful and balanced. They described the situation in ways that made it sound like a misunderstanding or a complicated relational breakdown, subtly placing responsibility on you without appearing openly hostile. The tone of these conversations was designed to establish credibility, making it seem as though they were simply explaining events logically rather than spreading negative impressions. Chosen One, the story presented to family members carried yet another tone. In those spaces, the narrative leaned heavily on vulnerability. They portrayed themselves as someone who had tried to maintain the relationship but had been hurt by your actions. By emphasizing their own pain and confusion, they encouraged family members to respond with instinctive protection. The more sympathetic the story sounded, the easier it became to reinforce the image of themselves as the injured party, while quietly positioning you as the source of the disruption. For distant acquaintances, the approach was different again. With people who did not know you well enough to question the details, the story became simplified and condensed. Only the most damaging fragments remained. In these conversations, they reduced the entire situation to a brief explanation that portrayed you negatively without requiring lengthy context. Because these acquaintances had little connection to you, the simplified narrative could spread quickly without resistance, shaping their perception of you before you ever entered the conversation. Chosen One, what makes this strategy so effective in the short term is its ability to control every room separately. Each audience hears a version of the story designed specifically for them, which means that no single person possesses the full picture. Friends believe they understand the emotional truth. Mentors believe they understand the logical explanation. Family members believe they understand the personal pain, and acquaintances believe they understand the basic facts. The result is a network of impressions that reinforce each other, even though none of them reflect the whole reality. This method reveals something important about the nature of the campaign. It was never about expressing honest pain or seeking genuine resolution. If the person had truly wanted understanding, they would have told one consistent story and allowed the truth to speak for itself. Instead, they constructed a system of narrative control. Their goal was to influence perception before questions could arise. By shaping how people saw you in advance, they hoped to ensure that any future conversation about your name would already carry a shadow of suspicion. Chosen One, this type of deception relies heavily on anticipation. The person understood that if they could establish a distorted portrait of you early enough, people would interpret your future actions through that lens. Even neutral decisions might appear negative if others already believed a certain story about you. By conditioning the environment in advance, they attempted to make it difficult for you to move freely without encountering the consequences of the narrative they had planted. While this campaign spread quietly through conversations you could not hear, you began noticing subtle changes in your environment. Doors that once seemed open began closing without explanation. Relationships that once felt warm grew distant or cautious. Invitations appeared less frequently, and opportunities that once seemed within reach suddenly shifted direction. The atmosphere around you carried a strange tension, as though something had changed in places you could not see. Chosen One, even though you could sense that something was wrong, you were never given full visibility into the conversations taking place behind the scenes. At times, you may have wished you could hear exactly what was being said so that you could correct it immediately. The instinct to defend yourself is natural when a reputation begins shifting unexpectedly. Yet heaven, in its wisdom, did not allow you to see every detail of the campaign as it happened. God understood that total exposure in real time would have pulled you into a battle that could easily consume your energy. If you had heard every accusation and every distorted version of your story, you might have felt compelled to respond in every direction. You could have spent countless hours explaining yourself, defending your intentions,
and trying to correct misunderstandings in conversations that never should have existed in the first place. The emotional fire created by that conflict could have drained your focus and distracted you from the path ahead. Instead, heaven chose a different form of protection. You were given discernment rather than complete information. Your spirit sensed that the environment had become unhealthy, and that awareness guided you toward distance without requiring you to confront every detail of the deception.
You knew enough to recognize that something in the relationship had become unbalanced, but you were not burdened with the exhausting responsibility of correcting every false narrative circulating around you. Chosen one, this restraint became one of the most important turning points in your story. At the time, it may have felt frustrating. Not knowing exactly what was happening can create uncertainty that is difficult to carry. Yet the protection hidden within that uncertainty allowed you to preserve your strength. You were able to leave the unhealthy dynamic without being trapped in endless arguments or emotional battles that would have benefited no one. By stepping away, instead of fighting every accusation, you also allowed time to reveal what words alone could not prove. Narratives built on distortion often collapse under their own contradictions, especially when the person being accused refuses to participate in the chaos. Your silence created space for truth to emerge naturally. Without constant conflict to feed the story, the inconsistencies within the campaign slowly became more visible. Chosen one, this is why you are now beginning to understand that restraint was never weakness. It was divine strategy. God protected you from entering a battlefield that would have consumed your energy without producing real resolution. By keeping you focused on your own path instead of on defending yourself in every room, He preserved your peace and positioned you for a future vindication that would not require self-destruction. The campaign that once seemed powerful depended on your participation in conflict to sustain itself. Without that reaction, the structure supporting the deception began weakening over time. People eventually notice inconsistencies when a story continues changing depending on the audience. The more versions that exist, the more difficult it becomes to maintain the illusion of truth. Chosen one, the realization you are reaching now marks a profound shift in understanding. You see that God's protection did not always appear as direct intervention or immediate exposure. Sometimes, protection looked like limitation. It looked like not knowing everything. It looked like being guided away from situations that might have consumed your energy if you had fully understood them at the time. In the end, the restraint that once felt frustrating becomes the very thing that preserved your dignity, your focus, and your peace. What you were kept from seeing protected you from fighting the wrong battle, allowing heaven to prepare a resolution that no amount of argument could have achieved. Chosen one, the collapse of the campaign did not happen suddenly or through a dramatic confrontation. It unfolded gradually, almost quietly, as truth began doing what it always does over time, exposing the weakness within anything built on falsehood. For a while, the strategy of spreading different versions of the story had seemed effective. Each group of people believed they understood what had happened between you and the person who had turned against you. Because the narratives were tailored carefully for each audience, no one initially realized that the versions were incompatible with each other. The unraveling began when people from different circles started speaking with one another. Conversations that had previously been separate slowly crossed paths. Someone who had heard one explanation mentioned it casually to another person who had been told something entirely different. At first, the differences seemed small, easy to dismiss as misunderstandings or minor exaggerations. Yet the more those conversations continued, the clearer it became that the inconsistencies were not minor at all. They were fundamental contradictions that could not exist within a single, truthful story. Chosen one. One person remembered being told that you had become distant and cold, someone who withdrew emotionally without explanation. Another person had heard a completely opposite description, that you were overly emotional and dramatic, creating unnecessary conflict where none existed. In yet another circle, the story had been framed as a complicated misunderstanding where both sides supposedly shared equal responsibility. Each group had accepted its version of the narrative, because it seemed plausible in isolation. But once those versions were placed side by side, the differences became impossible to ignore. As people compared what they had heard, questions naturally began forming. How could someone be both emotionally detached and excessively dramatic at the same time? How could the ending of the relationship involve one sequence of events in one story and an entirely different sequence in another? Why did each version seem to place the storyteller in the most sympathetic position, regardless of the circumstances? These questions created the first cracks in the structure that had been built around your name. Chosen One. The realization that followed was uncomfortable for many of the people involved. They began recognizing that they had unknowingly carried parts of a narrative that did not hold together under simple examination. Some of them had repeated those stories in conversations with others, believing they were sharing something true or meaningful. Now they faced the possibility that they had been used as unwitting messengers for a distortion that had nothing to do with reality. This awareness changed the emotional atmosphere quickly. When people realize they have been manipulated into spreading falsehood, the reaction is rarely neutral. Many feel embarrassed that they trusted a story without asking deeper questions. Others feel frustrated that their goodwill was used as a tool in someone else's attempt to control perception. The moment those feelings enter the room, the balance of power begins shifting away from the person who created the deception. Chosen One. The collapse accelerated from that point forward. Every attempt to repair the narrative only made the contradictions more visible. When the person tried to clarify one version of events, it exposed another version that no longer made sense. When they attempted to minimize certain details, someone else would recall a conversation that presented those details very differently. The effort to maintain control over the story required constant adjustments, and each adjustment created new inconsistencies that others could see. Truth has a unique advantage in these situations. It does not need to change in order to survive. Falsehood, however, requires constant maintenance. The more people who are involved in repeating a story, the more difficult it becomes to keep every version aligned. Over time, the differences accumulate until the structure collapses under its own weight. That is exactly what began happening around your name. Chosen One. The most striking part of this collapse is that you did not have to orchestrate it. You did not need to gather evidence, confront people publicly, or launch your own campaign to correct the narrative. The unraveling happened because truth eventually surfaced through ordinary conversation and comparison. The very network of people that had once carried distorted versions of your story became the environment where those distortions exposed each other. For many individuals observing the situation, the realization brought a new perspective on your silence during the conflict. At first, some may have interpreted your restraint as indifference or guilt. Now they began understanding that your decision not to participate in the chaos was a form of integrity. While narratives were being constructed and circulated behind the scenes, you continued living your life with steadiness and consistency. The contrast between those two approaches became increasingly visible as the deception fell apart. Chosen One. This moment of exposure marks an important transition, but it is not the true ending of your story. The collapse of the lie does not exist for the purpose of humiliating someone else or creating a spectacle of victory. Heaven's intention in allowing this unraveling is something far more constructive. The clearing of your name is simply the removal of an obstacle that once blocked the path in front of you. As the fabricated structure dissolves, you begin noticing subtle shifts in the environment around you. Conversations that once carried tension now feel more open. People who previously seemed uncertain about you start responding with renewed respect. Opportunities that once stalled begin moving again because the atmosphere surrounding your reputation is no longer clouded by suspicion. These changes are not dramatic acts of revenge, but quiet restorations of what should have existed all along. Chosen One. The people who truly matter are beginning to see the difference between the performed narrative and the life you have continued to live. While stories were circulating behind your back, your actions remained consistent. You continued working, growing, and maintaining your integrity, even when circumstances were confusing.
That consistency now stands in sharp contrast to the instability of the narrative that tried to define you. This difference is what ultimately restores credibility. Anyone can create a persuasive story for a short period of time, but the truth of a person's character becomes visible through the way they live when no one is applauding them. Your steadiness during the storm provided evidence that words alone could not erase. As people compare the narrative they were told with the reality they observe in your life, the gap between the two becomes impossible to ignore.
Chosen one, the most important part of this moment is not the collapse behind you, but the path opening in front of you. For a long time, the Whisper campaign functioned like a quiet barrier, blocking certain opportunities and creating hesitation in rooms you might otherwise have entered freely. Now that barrier is dissolving. Doors that once remained closed are beginning to reopen, not because you fought to force them, but because truth has restored the environment necessary for them to exist. The temptation at this stage is to keep looking backward at the explosion of the deception. It can feel satisfying to watch the structure that once harmed you collapse piece by piece. Yet heaven calls you to something greater than reflection on the past. Your assignment was never meant to revolve around defending your name. It was always about the future, waiting beyond the conflict. Chosen one, the exposure of the lie has served its purpose. The path in front of you is now clearer than it was before. Relationships that once carried hidden tension are revealing themselves honestly. New connections are appearing in spaces that are no longer influenced by distortion. Opportunities that once seemed distant are returning because the environment has been restored to truth. Your role now is not to stand in triumph over someone else's mistake, but to move forward with the same dignity that carried you through the conflict. The rooms ahead of you are different from the ones behind you. They are spaces where your name is not filtered through suspicion, where your character can be recognized without interference, and where your presence can contribute freely without the shadow of manipulation. Chosen one, the collapse of the campaign was never meant to define you. It was simply the moment when heaven removed what had been blocking the next stage of your journey. The real story begins not with the explosion of the lie, but with the quiet step you take afterward, as you walk forward into the relationships, opportunities, and purpose that are finally free from distortion. Chosen one, as this chapter of your story reaches its conclusion, a deeper understanding settles into your spirit. What happened around your name was never only about rumors, misunderstandings, or the ordinary conflicts that arise between people. It was something more demanding than that. It was a test of whether truth could survive without constant defense, whether integrity could remain steady even when false narratives moved freely through rooms you were not present to enter. For a long time, the temptation to correct every accusation must have been strong. Any person placed in that position feels the instinct to explain themselves, to gather evidence, to walk into every conversation determined to restore their reputation immediately. Yet you chose a different response. Instead of becoming reactive, you remained steady. Instead of answering noise with more noise, you held to dignity. Instead of allowing bitterness to shape your words, you continued living in alignment with the same values that had guided you long before the campaign began. Chosen one, that restraint did not always feel rewarding in the moment. Silence can feel uncomfortable when the atmosphere around you is filled with speculation. Walking away from arguments can feel like surrender when people assume the loudest voice must be the truthful one. Yet heaven was teaching you something deeper through that restraint. By refusing to fight every battle, you allowed time itself to become your ally. Time exposed the contradictions that arguments alone could never reveal. Conversations crossed paths. Stories that once sounded convincing collided with other versions of the same events. The more those narratives circulated, the harder it became to maintain the illusion that they were true. What arguments might have prolonged, time quietly dismantled. Chosen one, the lies did not collapse because you became louder than the people who created them. They collapsed because you remained real. While distorted versions of your character were spreading through conversation, your life continued moving forward in consistency and integrity. The contrast between the story and the reality became clearer with every passing day. Now you stand in a different place than where this chapter began. The atmosphere around your name feels cleaner because the confusion that once surrounded it has begun to fade. The path ahead appears clearer because the obstacles created by deception are dissolving. Most importantly, your sense of identity has grown stronger. You now understand that your value was never determined by what people said in rooms you could not enter. Chosen one, the lesson of this story will remain with you long after the rumors themselves are forgotten. Truth does not always win through confrontation. Sometimes it wins through endurance. Sometimes it wins through patience. And sometimes it wins simply because reality cannot be permanently replaced by a story. As you move forward, you do not carry bitterness from what happened behind you. Instead, you carry clarity. You understand who you are with greater certainty than before. You recognize the strength that comes from remaining aligned with truth, even when misunderstanding surrounds you. The next chapter of your life, therefore, begins not with defense, but with freedom. Your story continues in an atmosphere where your actions speak louder than any narrative ever could, and the life you now walk into will stand as quiet evidence that truth, when lived consistently, always outlives the lie.